It's almost like a bonus, this, isn't it? So we should just start.
We should just start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Hello.
This is the Cinematologists.
It is.
That's probably the first time on the main show we've not done our usual intro, and I'm always thinking, do we need to change our usual intro?
Well, we can't do it like this every time.
No.
Because we're not in the same room every time.
I know, it's great. You are here. Welcome to Champagne Socialist Towers.
It is, it feels odd. It's a world away from my normal surroundings, but it's nice to be back in the capital, and it's really lovely to be in the same room as you, chatting for the pod.
Yeah, I wonder whether people will notice a difference, really, with our remote recording.
Yeah,
I'm sure they will.
Let us know if there is a marked difference in how we are and how we talk to each other.
We're going to try and sync this without any editing at all.
Wow.
So,
okay. That might change how I do things.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, I know how we have a slightly different editing philosophy. I think I hack a lot more than you do, which is interesting because you like that. You like the sort of thinking through and the pauses and all of that kind of stuff. And at times, I when it's appropriate, I like it. But then other times, especially for myself, I'll hack myself to death when it comes to editing.
Yeah, no, I definitely do. There's certain things I always hack in myself, particularly. So I hack probably a lot more of me than I do of you. When I think we're probably a bit more self-conscious than we are. But I think you can tell there's a difference in terms of how we approach it. There's always things I look for, or listen for, I should say, rather than look for. But yeah, I do like the moments more. Yeah. And it's weird because Beth started doing a podcast, and she hacks everything. Like she's proper. And for me, I'm like, oh, don't leave that moment in. But I think that's again another reason why I think that it is what it is, because obviously we talk differently, we think differently, and we edit differently. I was just listening to a podcast on the way down to you about someone who was approached by a production company, and you just realise how many of these podcasts are produced, and they sound the same. Yeah, they do. Because they're meant to, because it's a product that you kind of know what you're getting. I'm not really interested in that. I think.
No, I mean, I was listening to the latest episode of Phantom Power, which is a sound studies podcast produced by a guy called Mark Hancock, who I interviewed on the Podcast Studies podcast, and it is as well produced a podcast as there is out there, and it's just him because he's a sound studies guy, he's a sound recordist and all this kind of stuff. And he's just done the third of a 3-episode series on sound studies and voices. So it's really influencing some of the work that I'm doing right now, because I'm preparing this video essay on AI voices and synthesized voices and stuff. But he just had Jonathan Stern on, who's this, again, a very well-known, well-respected sound studies guy who had a cancer in his throat, and he has this very old-school amplifier around he literally wears around his neck when he goes to conferences and all this kind of stuff, and it really made him think even more than he already did about the notion of mediated voices. And the fact that, I mean, one of the most interesting things on this last podcast that I just listened to was the idea that the voice that we have, the perspective we have of our own voices in our heads is nothing like what other people perceive us. And people who record and listen to their own voices quite a lot realize that. And when you first start recording a podcast and listening to yourself, it can be really disconcerting. You hate your own voice, but you do get used to it over time. But that sense of what is your original or grounded voice in relationship to your identity is just a perspective. It's a mediation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I thought about that the other day in terms of how much I've got used to my recorded voice and my podcast voice, because I sent Beth a voice message. She sends loads of voice. I'm not really a voice messenger. Although I watched a film which we're going to talk about, which does send a lot of voice messages, which I thought was interesting. But she played back the voice message while I was there. And it really startled me, because it wasn't in the context of headphones listening to the edit. It was out in the wild, but it was my recorded voice, and it really jolted me. I was like, I can't believe I sound like that. So yeah, that is a really interesting thing, isn't it? In terms of, like you say, that how you get used to that mediation, and how you almost forget that it is a mediation at all, until you get jolted out of it.
And the other thing is that has changed in the last couple of months is these mics that we're using today,
Yep.
which are fantastic, absolutely brilliant, better than the Blues. And I'm going to buy you one when we get out. And thanks to the Patreons for allowing that.
Thank you, Patreons.
Because honestly, I think that after using the Blue, and when you switch to this and hear your own voice, the texture is just entirely different.
Yeah.
And they are so good, and they're not much more expensive than the Blues were. They just provide to me a much better sound quality, and just being able to hold them closer to your face, it helps when you haven't got a soundproofed room.
Yeah, and that's the thing is I've got the sound at home in that room with the mic placement. But I can't take that mic elsewhere, and trying to find so to be a bit more portable and flexible would be great, and also have have that high quality sound. And I do like the way these sound, so I'll be looking forward to that as well.
Awesome. So what do you want to talk about? I mean, we put a very hasty little message out, and we did get one response in terms of something to talk about, which is body horror films, which we'll come to later on, maybe.
I think so, yeah. Maybe after dinner.
Yeah. Well, after I put dinner on.
Okay,
unfortunately, it'll be before dinner, but I'm not going to go into too much detail, I don't think, specifically. It was an interesting one, because it's like, I don't consider myself a horror and particularly a body horror fan, but then when I thought about it, I actually think I am. So it'd be good to list some of those and talk about some of those films.
And I thought he said about the comedy element was interesting.
It was an interesting one.
Looking forward to getting into that. So thanks, Mark, for your suggestion. We will get to that in a bit.
Why don't we start with The Northman? And you watched that last night?
I did watch it last night.
Yeah, I didn't get around to it, so
no worries. I went opening night in Stevenage and at Multiplex, nice cinema, and I was really surprised actually by how many people were there because it's a long film. It's like 2 hours and 20, and it's from the director of The Lighthouse.
Yep.
But it seemed to pull in the Gladiator crowd. I saw on the poster it was like this generation's Gladiator. And I can see that. I can see why they're going for that, and it felt like it was in that wheelhouse. I thought it was great.
Okay.
Yeah, I really liked it. Bleak, kind of, nihilistically, kind of so, and kind of grueling in terms of the story. But yeah, I thought it just looked amazing, sounded amazing. I love his detail. And I was trying to think about why I like his films and why I maybe don't like a film we're going to talk about in a bit. And I think it's because he's really interested in stories, it's not really ideologically driven. He's driven by details and periods and the relationships between people and place for sure. But he's interested in kind of like these archetypal stories, and it's very much sort of a Hamlet precursor story.
Gotcha.
It's actually drawn from the Norse legend that Hamlet sort of derived from, with takes a different track.
How's the lead? Because I haven't really seen this guy. I mean, I know of him and what have you, but he does seem to occupy these roles of hunky bit of meat in a crap movie.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. That has been sort of labelled at him before. Is he good?
Yeah, because he needs to be a hunky bit of meat.
Yeah,
it's a really kind of primal performance. He's the wrong. Well, yeah, he's the son avenging the father, who becomes a berserker. And really vicious mercenary, and that's a really kind of difficult sequence where you sort of see him as a sort of hired mercenary. But yeah, all he has to do is kind of brood and stew and sort of kill people,
okay.
Which he does really well. But what I really liked about his performance was this kind of physicality.
Okay,
he does. I mean, when he talks, he's it's kind of talking in the slogans, of vengeance.
But is it not? Would it not be a performance, say, in line with Russell Crowe, which has the physicality, but then there is a sort of vulnerability and a bit of, there's interesting elements of acting presence in that film, which he garnered awards, didn't he, for that, which was unusual for an action role.
Yeah. And I think Crowe's the better performance, but I also think that the story expects more from Crowe because of when he is wronged. This character is wronged as a child, sort of grows up with this kind of hate, and he carries the hate in his body in such an interesting way. Like he is this kind of hulk of a human, but he carries the weight of vengeance in a really clear way, which I thought was brilliant. And as he grows out of hate and is sort of facing the opportunity to not hate, I think there is a level of vulnerability there, which I thought was really interesting. And he's helped by Anna Taylor-Joy, who's brilliant.
Okay.
And I think he's such a good actor opposite people who, in Blade Runner, like where there's a man who's not emoting very much. She does a lot of heavy lifting, and I thought she was great. It was kind of gladiatory. It's a more serious.
Sorry to interrupt. Anya Taylor-Joy, was she in Blade Runner?
Isn't she in Blade Runner?
No.
I'm thinking of Anna de Armas.
Yeah, that's right.
What's Anya Taylor-Joy in then?
Anya Taylor-Joy. Well, she was in the Last Night in Soho, and she did
which I haven't seen.
You haven't seen?
She's in The Witch.
The Witch, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So she's sort of reunited there. The fanboys are going to go mad, aren't they? Sorry,
it's all right. I'll cut that.
Cheers. No, don't. I can take it.
I'll leave it in there.
Yeah, and so films. I like the sort of the Ray Harryhausen films, and it feels very much like a sort of classic mythical story. I wonder how it's going to go over with a blockbuster audience, because it's much darker,
right?
But it looks incredible. The production design and the environment is astounding.
It'd be really interesting to see where this sits in terms of an audience, because just on Twitter I was reading Jason Bailey on Ambulance, the Michael Bay movie, which has tanked in inverted commas, and can take the piss and say, well, Michael Bay, is he a movie maker 20 years out of date? But Jason Bailey was saying that if something like Ambulance tanks, which is not Transformers, it's a big, splashy blockbuster movie that's not part of a franchise but has a major Hollywood star in. It's like that idea of all there is now is tentpole comic book adaptations or art house fare, and there literally is no middle ground. So this would seem to me to be a middle ground movie,
Yeah, I think it's a classic middle ground movie, but I think what you're sort of saying there is what you sort of writing about in the newsletter. Like Transformers is recognizability.
Yeah.
Even though you can't really see much of what's going on, you kind of know who those toys represent.
It's brand.
It's brand. That's the thing, is you're identifying brand at each point. You can't identify a brand here other than his name seems very similar to Hamlet. So that's kind of the brand recognition is Hamlet, if anything. And like you say, the actors are not that recognizable. He's in stuff, Nicole Kidman, but I think it's TV. He's known for Big Little Lies and True Blood more than he's known for anything else. So it's. I wonder about the discourse, and I wonder about the box. The people coming out, they were a bit like, what did we just watch?
Yeah,
like the Friday night multiplex crowd was a bit like, but not. I didn't hear any kind of overt kind of like, that might have come later, but they certainly were like, what was that? What just happened? Particularly because the ending is a quite strange ending in terms of what you're expecting from a story like that. It sort of ends quite abruptly in a very dour way. I mean, it's a very dour film. But yeah, I was pleased I saw it at the cinema because it looked fantastic and it was kind of compelling in its darkness, which felt quite refreshing, I think.
Did you like The Lighthouse?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's my least favourite.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it up to a point, and I think it was the pushing of the fabulist element of it only goes so far for me, because, and maybe we'll talk about this when we're talking about Nightmare Alley and Guillermo del Toro's work more broadly, where if you're not really that fussed about that kind of world building, the fantasy carnivalesque type of world building or stuff that goes back to myths and legends, which I can watch, that's great, but it's not gonna super excite me. Then you get to the end, and if it's a 2 hour and a half movie, you're like, okay, so I get it, I get where we're going here.
And the Northman feels like it's a more epic story, so you get more of a sense of it being part of a sort of a cinematic history, like the Vikings and Ben-Hur and Spartacus. It feels, because all those stories are the same story, but but it does feel like you that it's more rooted in that. And I love those movies, and I sort of said like the Ray Harryhausen, because there's an interesting spiritual sort of metaphysical aspect to it, which I really liked. Kind of not overtly fantasy, but certainly it worked. It reminded me of The Green Knight, which I loved last year. I think
I really didn't get on with that movie. I love Lowry. It's just crazy.
And I was surprised how much I liked that. But it feels quite similar. Kind of of a piece. So you might. But it's much bigger. It's a much bigger movie than that. And I think it has lots of kind of cinematic pleasures. Sure. I'll be interested to see what happens with it, because it's not an A24 movie. It's a big Universal movie. So everything's on the screen. Just really thrilling.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, good friend of ours, Mark Jenkin, and there was a lot of lumping together, say, of The Lighthouse with Bait.
Yeah.
And they're very different movies, very different. Yeah. Just because they're black and white and they're kind of fishing.
And they're shot on film,
and they're fishing related.
Yeah.
But they are very, very different. And it's interesting how Mark has got his new film coming out, which has doubled down really on the minimalist filmmaking approach, whereas Eggers is like, he's maximalizing his sort of kudos, let's say.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see what Mark makes of it, knowing what he hopes to do in the future. It feels almost like Eggers is sort of 1 or 2 steps ahead in terms of scale, but certainly Ernest Main feels very different to this. I don't think they'll be comparing this to...
No, probably not.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's that, which I am interested to see, and maybe it is one that I will go to the cinema because it looks like it's requiring of that, let's say.
It rewards that for sure. I would treat it like you did the Batman, Sunday afternoon, big movie, after a roast.
True.
It's and I think that it's a good movie for that.
Right.
I thought it was very entertaining cinematically. I enjoyed that it was cinematic. Even though it's a dark story and it's revengey and a bit muddy, it felt like I was watching a piece of cinema, and seeing it in the cinema was great for that.
Marvelous. Yeah. So again, segueing off from that, I think what's interesting is that when we were having a chat about what we were going to talk about, because we wanted to, with this episode and you just turning up, we wanted to not really have a overarching theme or not worry too much whether there was one. But you said that you had I'd said I was going to watch Nightmare Alley, and you said you had a Guillermo del Toro rant ready to go. And then I started watching Nightmare Alley and quite, really enjoyed it in many ways. And I mean, I hate when people say, "Oh, I have a problem with this movie." Like, Guillermo del Toro gives a shit. But you know what I mean? It's like I enjoyed it, but I spotted things that I found that I didn't enjoy so much, or I would critique it for. But what was your sort of the kernel of your rant, and then you could expand into it, lean into it.
I was angry at the end of it. Because I'd liked it,
Right.
I thought, it looked incredible. I just thought this film looks beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful films I've seen in an age. And I liked the kind of the languid pace of it, I liked kind of just sort of like trying to soak into that world. What I was angry about at the end was I felt nothing. Throughout, I was constantly being jolted out of the atmosphere by this sense in the performances and the kind of the overarching tone of the film that what I was watching was meaningful,
Right. Okay.
And I was like, and it happens sometimes with films. It happens with his films where it's almost like it's saying, it's telling me this is important, that this is a really important piece of work. And I'm like The Revenant, or like The Shape of Water. Like I'm not getting that. Like if this feels like a genre film, one of the reasons I enjoyed The Northman so much, because it's so obviously a kind of an ancient story, and it's just like, this is the story. Like you can read into, there's probably a political reading of it, but I didn't feel like the film was presenting me this kind of like important human story, other than like, this is what people are like, and have been for centuries and centuries. So I was kind of like, why are you constantly making me feel in these performances that there's something here that's, and then it just felt so controlled. It felt so controlled and so airless by the end of it. I was just like, it literally dissipated as soon as it was over, and I was just like, it felt like a missed opportunity.
Right, that's interesting, because I read it more as leaning into that tension between the sheen of it, the hyper stylized element, which I think relates back to the almost claustrophobia that you feel that it's so controlled, as you were saying. But then there was a sort of tension with that and the scuzziness of the subject matter, and trying to lean into the more salacious and grimy elements of film noir, which you can never reproduce Night of the Hunter, simply because on the screen it looks amazing. And I watched it here, and again, a little bit like The Northman, it's kind of like, why was I not compelled to go and see this? And I think again, it's Del Toro for me. I'm not compelled to go and see his work. I went to see The Shape of Water, again, admittedly, because it was up for awards, and I was like, I want to try and get a few of these movies in before they disappear. And I enjoyed that, again, on a very surface level, and I enjoyed this more for its surface element. It just looked fantastic. And
it did.
The story, again, as a screenwriter, I thought was very processional. It was just signposting stuff like traffic lights, big time. You know, the narrative, I've just kind of, oh, that's going to come back, and it did, and that's going to come back, and it did. And then it does that thing where you have to suspend your realist approach to filmmaking and say, this is not a realist movie. So you can't sort of say, well, nobody would act that way because it's just so obvious what is going to come next.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I mean, I've written a note down here. It's something that wants to be sophisticated and ambivalent is essentially an airport novel, a beautifully written one. Yeah. So in a sense, I think but I didn't get annoyed by that like you did, if you see what I mean, you know?
Yeah, and I don't really know where that annoyance comes from. And I think possibly it comes from an unfair... It's not really at Del Toro or the film, really. I mean, a lot of it is students. You know, which,
it's all students.
It's all students. You know, in a sorry again, yeah. Only in a sense that he has become this kind of leading light filmmaker, and like most of the filmmakers that students sort of hold up as their leading lights, you know, the Tarantinos, the Edgar Wrights, the Inarritus, they just seem to be getting less and less interesting as they go on. Which not to say they're not capable of good work. You know, I enjoyed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for the most part, and I really loved Edgar Wright's Sparks doc. I think that's wonderful. But it's like there's no critical engagement with it. So I was probably watching it prejudiced. And I tried to watch it I didn't watch it at the cinema because all the students went at I was like, I didn't watch it during awards. It was just on. And I really wanted to just let it wash over me. And when it started, and I was like, wow, this is...
Yeah,
this is
looks
gorgeous.
Incredible.
Like, you know,
I mean, the production design and cinematography are just so... I mean, they are controlled, and it's, like you said, that's a good word, but it's also so specific.
Yeah.
And every kind of light position has been decided to within an inch of his life, you know?
And that was a thing, I think the thing is like that... I like his... I mean, we know I love Pacific Rim, you know, but there's a messiness to it, which I like, and there's a messiness to his Hellboy films, which I like. And I kept thinking of The Prestige, you know, because I think they're quite similar, but I kept remembering the experience of seeing The Prestige and really having a tension about where's this going, you know, like, because I think it's a better written movie. And here I was like, yeah, all I can do is look at it because I know it, because I've just this, like you say, this scene, particularly the scene with Defoe where they drop off the geek. I was like, oh, you know, like it's like you don't trust anyone to get the significance of any scene, so you're kind of, hey, this is a really important scene, and I'm like, oh, now I know. And honestly, that's like an hour in, if that. I've got another hour and a half of this. Yeah,
no, for sure. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I mentioned earlier on the Last Night in Soho. They could be all of a piece in terms of absolutely surface beauty to look at cinematically, completely in love with cinema as a network of signs or symbols, and almost when it comes to narration and storytelling, absolutely obvious. So, you know, there's so many references that even seasoned film goers, lovers, teachers like us would have to look up. But yet the sophistication doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting. I was actually going to read this out to you. I'm just going to make a little move in my flat here. Well, I've got this. It's so organic.
Got a book handy. It's got a book handy.
So I'm reading this.
Okay.
Right? Which is, for our audience, it's Martin Amis's novelized autobiography. And reading this, it's kind of reminded me that there should be an aspiration to identify objective beauty, or at least recognize and analyze or conceptualize why art is good or not, right? And the content of it should in many ways be secondary to that. So Martin Amis, think of him as a character. Is he racist? Is he sexist? Some people would take offense at certain ways he has of articulating things, and definitely therefore maybe thinking, you know? He's an old white guy, and he has, you know, he comes from a specific context. However, reading this, you just can't deny the literary craftsmanship.
Yeah.
It's as good as anything I've ever read, really. You know, his way of crafting words. And, you know, this is both joyous and infuriating because on the one hand, you know, it's the effortless talent. And, you know, I have a thing about that. It's like, you know, how can you compare yourself to something that's good? And then, you know, the problem of when he's offensive, you're like, why are you so good? And then you're this offensive. Do you know what I mean? But there's one passage I actually wanted to read to you, and it speaks exactly to what we're talking about here. So let me just find the right page. So this is it. So listen to this. But this is about literature. But I think it relates very much to what you've just said about cinema. So he says here, and he's talking about the relationship between the writer and the reader. Okay. Yeah. Detectable 2 has been a recording of the relationship between writer and reader. In the plainest of times, a relationship of inexhaustible complexity and depth. We like difficult books, littérateurs used to claim. And this supposed preference turned into a rallying cry for the cause of high modernism. Perhaps we did indeed once like difficult books, but we don't like them anymore. Difficult novels are dead. We no longer court difficulty, partly because the reader-writer relationship has ceased to be even remotely cooperative. Whatever you do, don't expect the reader to deduce anything. I learnt that the hard way with my 11th novel from 2006. One of its protagonists, an American girl called Venus, is black, and her ethnicity is shored up by so much internal evidence that somehow I felt it would be ham-handed to spell it out. Surely Venus Williams was doing the job for me. The result? Not a single reader I'm aware of has ever doubted for a moment that Venus is white. Mark my words, every piece of vital information has to be clearly stated in plain English. When it comes to inferring and surmising, readers have downed tools. The unreliable narrator, once a popular and often very fruitful device, has given way to the era of the unreliable receptor. The unreliable narrator is dead. The deductive novel is dead. Now, reading that, honestly, it reminds me a lot of the conversations we have about what filmmakers make. So is it the filmmaker's fault, or is the filmmaker responding to an audience that is not trained to be able to deduce things in the way that perhaps we would expect or like?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question.
The problem is I'm generalizing massively, and so is he, and you kind of can't do that, you know?
No, but I think that one of the reasons I really was a bit angry at Nightmare Alley was that at the end of 2.5 hours, it asked nothing of me.
No.
It was all presented so easily, and it was all text. And I think you look at the two films we've covered in the last 2 episodes, Boiling Point and Happer's Comet, the other end of the scale from this film, but
sure.
they're holding on to a tension, that is part of the experience of watching those movies, and that was exciting, and that was rewarding because it's inviting me in cinematically. It's not dragging me in, I don't feel, and I wonder how much of it is the filmmakers, maybe not even conscious, maybe it's unconscious, maybe it's the result of a career of notes and reviews and these things creep in, the rough edges get smoothed away, and I think it happens at that level for sure. And I guess it's just I'm not that interested in it. My worry, I think, is knowing that, talking to students about it and seeing that they're responding to those films is not bad, but if we're going to say actually these films are better than these films, and that this is more interesting, and it's there's more going on, and then the worry is that if you take this as the example, what's your work going to be like? If it's responding to this in any kind of way, conscious or unconscious, that fills me with dread.
And how can you make a no budget 7-minute student short when the sophistication and the money that goes into the production values to create the sheen, which is the thing that is good about these films a lot of the time, then how do you get students to become sophisticated to make difficult stories, or stories that don't reveal themselves in obvious ways in that way? It's very hard.
It is really, really hard. But then I think also, Nightmare Alley is a film which is recreating moods and textures that were done very cheaply and very quickly, and weren't. I always, and the Tarantino thing's the same. It's taking exploitation, it's taking noir, and it's taking all these things which were produced very, very quickly on the hoof with no budget and no time, where innovations were made by necessity, and is spending 3 weeks and all the money in the world recreating that. It doesn't feel like it's doing the same thing. And that is missing, and I find that interesting. And that, if you were to look at the original Nightmare Alley, that's what students would be looking at. That was shot really quick.
Yeah.
Small crew.
Yeah.
But they're not. They want, like you say, they want to live in this luxurious world, and it felt like a luxurious film in all the wrong ways. In a way that, again, to think about the Northman, is it looks like the characters are having a hard time. In a way that when I watched The Revenant, it looked like the actors were having a hard time. And we were
Give him an Oscar, he's cold.
Exactly. It was so like, isn't this an amazing feat?
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't want to see an amazing feat. I want to feel it, but I want to feel like I'm witnessing something that is, the filmmaking is just different. I get, and maybe that's just an accumulation of the amount of films, and also, remembering that Del Toro is a filmmaker that we follow generationally, from Kronos and Devil's Backbone, which were, low budget, interesting. And I don't begrudge him that at all. It's got nothing to do with that. And like I say, I enjoyed it. And I like Bradley Cooper, I enjoy watching him. The cast was great. Yeah. I think there was a lot of other voices that were invading. And at the end, it was just, it literally, as soon as it finished, I was...
No, that's it. I agree. Yeah. I agree. And maybe you set a little bit more store by Guillermo del Toro as an auteur than I would. You know what I mean? Because that was the big disagreement, wasn't it, over Pacific Rim? Because you can see the directorial elements of that, whereas I'm kind of like, I'm not sure,
Well, that's the thing, because I was going back from, Kronos, Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, the Hellboy films, which I really enjoy. But then if I look post Pacific Rim and I look at Crimson Peak and I look at Shape of Water and I look at this, I'm like, it's whatever happened, there's a level of comfort which I find uninteresting. That doesn't make me think, his old work is better, but certainly makes me less interested in seeing what he's doing. But then also knowing I have to go into the classroom and students want to say how great it is, and I'm like, well, why? What is it? Okay. What is it you think is great about this? But they, as we've said before, it's look great. What an amazing cinematography. And it was, amazing. Beautiful.
Great. So let's take a little break. I'm going to put the dinner on, and we'll see you in a few minutes. If you enjoy The Cinematologists and think the podcast is valuable to you in some way, please consider supporting us. You can do this by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or Good Pods. This really helps us get traction and visibility. Or you could share an episode on your social media. Any reviews or comments we get, we do tend to discuss on the main show. Or perhaps you could just tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Research suggests that the number one factor that aids podcast discoverability is personal recommendation. So if you have a friend or a colleague who you think would like the episode, please let them know about it. Also, for less than the price of a coffee, you could join our Patreon site. You will get access to our bonus podcasts and our monthly newsletter, in which we write an extended article and give a host of cultural recommendations. Corporate money is flooding into podcasting, and while there are brilliant shows being produced in all genres, there is a lot of formulaic content and celebrity chit-chat, which just sounds like mediocre radio. The uniqueness, authenticity, experimentation, and passion that made podcasting something unique and different is being overwhelmed by corporate formalism and institutional gatekeeping. We are a fully independent, ad-free podcast. Goes back into making our product better. Thanks very much for your continued support. And now, back to the show.
All right, so we're back and the dinner smells good. I'm very excited, very hungry, looking forward to that. And food is obviously, part of the recent history of the podcast, from our Boiling Point episode, which is out there. Did that inspire you to get back in the kitchen? You're always a bit of a kitcheny person anyway.
Oh,
you
no,
like
I cook all the
so,
time.
Yeah,
I cook all the time. And again, it's funny, but the reflections on doing the last podcast, it just reminds me that we go to restaurants as regularly, but not super regularly, because I just get disappointed.
Yeah.
And a lot of places you spend between 70 and 100 quid for two people these days.
Yeah.
And it's average.
Yeah.
And now, I'm very lucky privileged enough to be able to live in this place here, but also, we bought a house, and there's places around that just have amazing ingredients, amazing produce that you could buy. And, whether it's following recipes or doing my own thing, you just can make amazing stuff and not pay through the nose. I'd rather get those for then buy an expensive bottle of wine. That's the way around it for me. And I'm somebody who, I don't know when I decided this, but it's kind of like, I don't spend a lot of money on kind of expensive stuff.
Yeah.
I haven't got that kind of desire to own huge amounts of things. But what I do spend my money on is food, good food and good wine. And that's what I think is more important to me when it comes to what I'd spend my money on.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to sampling some delights in a bit.
Awesome.
And keeping on the Boiling Point theme, you said that you'd watched a new release, and it was interesting in the light of Boiling Point, which was Zero Fucks Given.
Yeah, this is this French-Belgian co-production from directors Emmanuel Marre and Julie Lecoustre. And it stars Adele Exarchopoulos, who is well known from Blue is the Warmest Colour. And interesting actor, I think, in terms of she's remained essentially within a kind of European art house context, whereas Léa Seydoux obviously has become an international star, really. And I don't know whether that may be a conscious choice or whether there isn't a sort of, it's always difficult whether, I don't think it's anything to do with acting ability, because I think she's a very good actor. And especially in this role, it's quite similar to Blue is the Warmest Colour in that it's not quite coming of age, but it is that sense of a young woman trying to navigate her relationship with her family, the world of work, the corporate world of work, and her own sense of herself and her attachment to people around her, or a detachment, as it is in this movie, to people around her. So it's basically set in the transient life of a low-cost airline, and she is an air stewardess, an air hostess for this airline. And what's interesting about it is, again, in a very different way, it goes behind the scenes of that particular industry and presents a sort of rawness of it. And very different in terms of the way that it's shot structurally, because obviously there was the one take with Boiling Point, whereas this is a lot of fragmentary vignettes is the wrong word, but little parts in the story that are cut and jumped to that are never quite completely finished. Sort of snapshots, I would say, snapshot scenes. Yeah. And what's interesting, I think, for me was, that you get a lot of the tyranny of worker surveillance, working for a company that's all about them wanting to make money out of you selling, for example, perfumes and food and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a regimen around that. And then there's very, very kind of tight controls over presentation and the way that you have to behave and all this. And this is like at the bargain basement sort of Ryanair type airline. And there's always this sort of, I think her kind of dream is to go and fly on Emirates. And a lot of her and her co-workers sort of talk about that, getting to Emirates. And because that's seen as kind of having a classiness and a higher kudos. And, there's this one great scene where she's discussing that she doesn't feel that she sort of represents what this airline requires in terms of languages, but also, being classy in quote unquote. So it's really interesting in terms of class elements of that, which is, intersected with sort of femininity and gender and these kinds of things. But also that there is fleeting relationships. She's obviously moving from country to country, from place to place. So she has these fleeting relationships, and there's drug use and alcohol use to kind of cope with the aspects of loneliness. And then you get the scenes that allude to a problematic relationship with the father, who's both disappointed and disapproving at the same time. I think her mother is dead, but we never get... Again, it's not fully explained, and you have to work to kind of see that. And it's all exclaimed through the interiority of her exterior moments. Like, there's just this... There's a couple of really standout scenes. One is where she gets a phone call from a mobile phone operator asking her to change contracts, and she's signed with her mother's name. And she just kind of like starts crying while she's on this phone call. It's just a beautifully subtle piece of acting. And then there's this other moment where she's trying to pass a kind of cabin manager's exam. And they have the really well sort of structured scene where all of these air stewards who are trying out for this exam are practicing their smiles. And she literally can't smile for the camera. And off screen, you have this tutor who's telling her, you have to put all your emotions to one side. You are only here for the customer. And it's just a great piece of acting, her pretending that she can't smile. It's really, really well done. So, yeah, pretty raw. Like I say, it does show you the opposite side of this industry that has a facade a little bit like, the hospitality industry with a really powerful central performance, I thought.
Yeah, I like it a bit more now.
Okay, you didn't like it?
Well, no, it's not I didn't like it. It was so depressing.
Yeah, it's depressing.
Like, it's so bleak. And you just like, I think what I struggled with was that it had a few sort of, I thought, cinematic flourishes, but otherwise it just felt like this relentless reminder of how screwed up the world is, and that this is work now, and it's just miserable. And she's great. Like, she really carries just the shittiness of it, of her life in a really fascinating way. I think, there were moments where I was like, I want it to be a bit more like this. It didn't really seem to know how it was going to do the thing. There were some lovely quiet moments, like where she's with one of her relationships and there's a really lovely shot, and she's just like, he's like, do you want to go and take a shower? And she's like, no. Yeah. And there was a really nice kind of like feeling in that scene, which no, I didn't dislike it. I just thought, it was hard work, but sort of,
it's all in her performance though,
it's all in her performance. Yeah. And what was really striking was the ending for me, where so there's this really icky, she has this really icky sort of video interview for a private airlines, essentially, like private jets and sort of elite sort of private airline, and it's just really icky. And then like he says, can you come to Dubai? And you get this really strange scene, which I really like, the end scene where she's in Dubai and it's COVID. They shot it during COVID, which was interesting because obviously there's no real sense of that elsewhere. It's only in the final scene. But the whole film is about like a aspiration. Like, you should aspire. Like, she's aspiring. Like, her friend's aspiring to Emirates. She's not really. No. She doesn't. She's kind of a bit more bit disconnected. But there's this sense of you should be aspiring to this thing, and even in your job, you should be aspiring to spy on your colleagues and report on your colleagues. You should be aspiring to be better and set, like, it's all aspirational. And it's like the aspiration is Dubai, and it's this symbol of kind of, that's where people want to go on holiday. And I'm watching this scene, and it's such a blank scene, and it works really well because it's like, is this Dubai? Like, it's horrible. Yeah, it is. There's all these people filming this fountain show, which is dreadful. And it's like, wow, this is the aspiration. Get here, spend money, look at this thing, which is objective. We're talking earlier about what's objectively good and bad art. This is objectively bad. Like, it's a terrible pop song. They've managed to make some water move in interesting directions, and then it's like skyscrapers. And like, you just feel like this is what we're being told to work towards, and it's horrible. And she doesn't know how to feel about it, and we don't know how to feel about it. And I thought I really liked the ending. I was like, it made me feel, again, angry, but angry at the right things.
But this is a massive critique of global capitalism.
It's a huge critique.
But it places it, embodies it in this particular person who is able to carry the weight of that, which is why I think it's a good piece of work. I understand what you're saying about, like, the asides with the family and stuff like that. Maybe there wasn't enough kind of connecting tissue, maybe, of that, perhaps.
It was more just, it wasn't really that. I liked the fragmented bit, and I like the fact that you do like, you kind of know that her mum's dead, but she doesn't really know a lot about it. It's clear that she fled at the time, and the family is not getting on and struggling to communicate. And the father's kind of telling her about her life. It's clear his life is in free fall.
And the sister as well is kind of at home, and it's kind of like there's a difference between, she's sort of justifying being an air stewardess and making it sound like, oh, I'm here, one day I'm in here, another day I'm over Europe, and they're always so glamorous, and then you see what she has to do,
and we know it's
just not glamorous at all.
It was more just like I guess the decision to just film it the way they did just felt like I wanted a bit more of a cinematic approach, because it's in her performance. And when the camera's on her, it's like, she can just hold it so well. That was it, really. It wasn't really I didn't like it. It was just I wanted it to. Because again, you just like, it's such a stark reminder of how crappy the world is. I wanted an interesting kind of visual, and that there were flourishes of that. There's some interesting sequences where they've obviously, I think they probably, and this is I imagine it was like low budget, shot it quickly.
Yeah.
It's a very indie movie, and there are glimpses of where they've obviously found a moment to capture, that kind of alienation. Word of the, in a really interesting way. So yeah, but listening to you talk about it, actually, I'm like, I think there is more to it than I probably thought initially when I only watched it this afternoon. So yeah.
And you can still catch that on Mubi.
Yes, and make sure you do. But gird your loins.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, if you want Saturday night date movie, it isn't that.
It ain't that. Yeah.
Okay, body horror.
Body horror. So Mark asked, he said he just watched Titane and said he was a bad cinephile. And it made me feel bad.
Bad cinephile.
Because I haven't seen it.
You're a bad cinephile.
I'm the worst cinephile, like the worst witch. I will, but I have not yet. But he was sort of asking about kind of body horror and comedy and the relationship between the two and other examples. And
that's the best thing about Titane for me. I liked the previous film Raw a lot more than Titane. And the reason, again, was interestingly, was I thought it was sort of incoherent in a sort of story sense. And then weirdly, it kind of changes gear in a way that didn't really make sense to me. It became about something else.
Yeah.
So, it's one of those things where I'm like, there's a lot of really amazing images in this, and there's a great central performance, but I'm like, but what's this about actually? And like there's a sort of really overtly surrealist moment early on, and the whole thing is kind of, it's body shot weirdness. It's kind of not realist at all. But that then gets to put to one side again at the very end. It becomes about something else. So it'd be interesting from a story perspective what you make of it. But yeah, I was just thinking about some of the stuff. I mean, we've covered quite a lot of body horror on the podcast now. I mean, I'm thinking about like for example, Eyes Without a Face, which is one of my favorites. And probably my favorite body horror of all time is Cronenberg's The Fly. Yeah, I would say.
I noted.
Yeah, I fucking love that movie. That's amazing. That film.
It is amazing. Did we do that on the podcast? Or
no, we didn't.
We did a talk on that. We did a double bill, didn't we? We programmed a double bill of that and The Thing.
Yeah, it was part of that sci-fi season.
The BFI sci-fi season down in Falmouth, yeah.
Because you did The Thing, and you talked about The Fly with The Thing, didn't you? Because I did Rollerball.
You did Rollerball, and I did The Thing. Did I do The Thing on The Fly? I definitely did The Fly, because we talked about Jeff Goldblum as a scientist, and which is where I think a lot of the comedy comes from, is just the casting of Goldblum.
It's hilarious.
And I think The Thing is a great body horror as well, but not as funny.
No.
Yeah, so go on. Yeah. So The Fly.
The Fly. I mean, Videodrome and Existence. I mean, watch those three for kind of mainstream body horror via Cronenberg, and I'm really looking forward to Crimes of the Future. I was on Mary Wilde's podcast, and she asked me, "What are you looking forward to?" And I literally couldn't think of a thing, because I haven't sort of been to Berlin. I haven't sort of looked around. It was just kind of like, oh my God, now I'm the bad cinephile. So yeah, completely useless. But I am looking forward to that. And my other big one, which I always reference, is Demon Seed from 1975, which is a film that I think gets more and more dangerous to ask people to watch. The more time goes on, because it is shocking in parts, in a really weird 70s misogynist kind of way, and dodgy kind of way. But an amazing film, though. Yeah,
absolutely. And you programmed that as well, didn't you? Or you talked about that?
No, we did it. I did it a couple of times on Modules. In Falmouth.
I remember we definitely watched it at some point. And talked about it. Yeah. Great example.
I've never been really sort of into this idea of body horror for its own sake, like the torture porn stuff, like Human Centipede or what's it, a Serbian film. I'm not fussed, and like even now, as I'm getting older, I'm more squeamish than I ever was. But the other thing that I just wanted to mention was the visual artist Mariana Simnit, who we had on the show for the video essay episode a couple of years ago now. Her work is very interesting. If you're into kind of the idea of the body as a vessel for getting in touch with senses of the self that are dark and problematic and sort of icky and this kind of thing, and sort of playing around with that kind of stuff. That's Mariana Simnit. So Google her work in this area.
Absolutely. My list was quite similar, mostly Cronenberg, because I think that it is that. I think his films are very funny. I think that Videodrome is very funny. And I think a lot of the time there is it doesn't make it palatable, it's probably the wrong word, but it doesn't make it any less kind of shocking, but it certainly changes the relationship to the horror when there's this clear satirical underpinning to it, and I'm thinking of something like Naked Lunch as well.
Yeah.
Where there's a clear relationship between the bodily and the character, and it creates this really interesting, unstable space of what's kind of going on, what's real and what's not, which I really like in his work. The other thing that I thought of, weirdly, was Bruce Robinson's How to Get Ahead in Advertising.
Oh, right.
Which is a kind of comedy, very dark comedy with Richard E. Grant. But, where the kind of the talking boil,
Yeah.
Which I just thought was
just horrific, isn't it, that? Oh, my God.
It is. And it's a film I haven't seen in a long time. And it did make me think I'd like to revisit that. Because that was a really striking film. And again, as a British film, a really interesting piece of work. And, just, again, kind of shocking and grotesque, but very, very funny. So those are the ones I
You've been ever into the the early Peter Jackson stuff?
Yes,
schlock stuff.
Yeah, Bad Taste. And, big fan of Bad Taste and Brain Dead. Yeah, I mean, Peter Jackson's similar to what we were talking about earlier. Really, like I really like Heavenly Creatures, not body horror, and I really like The Frighteners. And I do.
Kronos is body horror.
It is. It is. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of vampire stuff is. So. Yeah, and again, I think that I think Kronos is quite a funny movie. Again, it's just I like the physical. That kind of that low budget innovation.
And the other thing, I mean, again, from an more art house perspective, and again adjacent to sort of French extremism, like Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day and High Life as well has body horror elements. I was thinking also of Son of Cronenberg's Possessor.
Yeah,
you should definitely watch that if you haven't seen it. And then the big one in terms of sort of historically, that I think you look at the lineage going back from a French perspective, is Man Bites Dog, which does contain that kind of black horror, black comedy element of the horror, where it's making the audience uncomfortable for laughing. So it gives them the humor, and then punches them in the face with the disgustingness, let's say.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a great example. Again, it's that. I think it's most productive in that kind of satirical space, and obviously Man Bites Dog is quite a pointed satire, isn't it? In that sense. So I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. There's a lot of that sort of new, that's before the kind of the new French extreme period. But that, again, which just the less and less humor. It's interesting thinking about those films when that question came up. I was like, there's not a lot of laughs in there.
No,
a lot of the stuff, it's everything's very, very serious. And I think that is why those sort of films and sort of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead films from that period hold up. Because they are interested in something, but not just like ramming home, this is a very earnest and serious thing. It's like, I'm going to smuggle it in with Bruce Campbell, which is always a good way of doing it, I think.
Sure. I hope that has hit your body horror spot. There's a list there that you can go to if you haven't seen many of them. I mean, if you haven't seen The Fly, then you really are a poor cinephile.
Yeah, I think that's the line, isn't it? That's the line. If you're below the line on that, then you're officially a bad cinephile.
Sure. Anything else you wanted to mention or talk about?
I did. Well, I saw All the Old Knives.
Okay. Which I've yet to see, but it's on my list.
It's interesting, isn't it? On the Little Gold Men podcast, which I listen to, which is sort of an award season podcast, the question always comes up about Amazon in terms of like, what are they doing?
Yeah.
And Ted Hope's involved in a lot of stuff, and a lot of the doc stuff's really good. But it's like, what? And I noticed he produced the Tender Bar, but they're kind of making that mid-range, dramatic, serious adult work, but it's not getting awards, and it's not at cinemas. It's kind of just on the serve, and I think obviously that doesn't feel like where the investment is intended. I think it's intended to end up there with lots of laurels, and it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. So this All the Old Knives is a strange film. Chris Pine and Tandy Newton, kind of ex-lovers in Vienna, working for the CIA and in the embassy there, and there's a kind of a terrorist attack that goes badly, and then sort of it's 8 years later, and they're sort of reopening the case, and Chris Pine is sent out to investigate and sort of reconnect with Tandy Newton, and they had a thing from back in the day. So it's an interesting setup, and it was a weird one because I was enjoying it, and I thought this is a nice enough movie, and then I watched it in two halves, And in between watching the first half and the second half, I just had a thought, where I was just like, oh, I think it's this. And then when I went back in, literally within the first 5 minutes, I was like, it's this. And also realised that, it's kind of interesting contemporary film production. It's obviously shot very recently, I think, and most of it is the two of them in a restaurant, a sparse restaurant, so it's like I started to see almost the COVID impact.
Right.
Actually, there's not very many locations here, and those locations there's very few people here.
So is it a serious talky film then? It's not
a
action.
Serious, it's not an action film. No, it's a kind of Cold War drama essentially,
Gotcha.
transposed to the 2010s, and it's got that kind of it's a whodunit essentially.
Right.
Like, so at the start of the film, you realise that someone within the CIA tipped off the terrorists in the station in Vienna, and so Jonathan Pryce is in it, and Lawrence Fishburne and stuff. And it was one where I think that stepping away from it and coming back, I could when I came back, I could see the production. It was like, oh, they had Lawrence Fishburne for a day.
Right. So
he's in like 3 scenes.
You figured out the numbers that it was being made by.
Yeah, and it's weird because the gap, I think, did it a disservice. I know you shouldn't watch a film in gaps, but obviously sometimes that's just the way it is at the moment. But it was interesting because the second half was flavoured by the gap, and I thought it was enjoyable, but it definitely, I knew how it was going to end,
right,
and that lessened the impact of the film. But again, it was a curious film. I'm like, these are recognizable stars in this movie. I don't know who this movie is for now.
Right.
Not that movie should be for them, but like in a kind of like, would this be released now? How, what is this thing now? And it's a kind of curio in that sense. And it's not good enough to break through. Like, it doesn't have anything about it where it's like, in the same way that The Tender Bar, which I really liked, I was like,
who's going to see this?
How are you going to go to bat for this in that marketplace? In that, you're like, how can you say you've got to see this thing? I would not recommend that you have to see this thing.
Streaming has created a real serious marketing problem for movies.
Yeah,
and TV, and now more and more TV. I think
because there's so much TV. Like, how do you stand out in the crowd? Yeah.
And actually, it becomes, what's interesting is like I don't know if you ever feel like this as well. It's kind of like creating that cultural life. I know that sounds grandiose, but that sense of, I'm not going to engage with this, but I am going to engage with this, actually becomes more and more difficult because the identity of things is so uncertain. Because there may be good people in it, but that's no guarantee of quality anymore.
No.
Do you know what I mean? It's like weird because I remember I was listening to the Tony Scott stuff with the Silver Screen podcast, and they, in the middle one, they went to bat for Tom Cruise because he was in Top Gun, he was in Days of Thunder with Tony Scott, and we've talked about Tom Cruise. We must do a Tom Cruise actual episode, or one of the films at least.
Yeah, for sure.
And I recognise a lot of people hate Tom Cruise, and there's lots of problematic elements with the Scientology and all that. But it's amazing how even when he had that lull with the whole Katie Holmes thing and got kicked out of Paramount, before and after that lull, there's still a guarantee of quality around a Tom Cruise movie that isn't there for I mean, who else is there where you just think there is a guarantee of quality? It's very rare, I think, these days. Yeah,
you kind of know that there's going to be a level of enjoyment.
You are going to see on the screen. Tom Cruise is going to be everywhere, doing everything, and the money is on the screen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that is hard to know where that is. But interesting, on the Paramount thing, have you ever read The Hollywood Economist?
No.
A really interesting book, and it talks about Tom Cruise's exit from Paramount.
Yeah.
It's about the business of movies. And I read it probably about 10 or so years ago. But it's really interesting in terms of like it reminds you that Tom Cruise was not kicked out of Paramount because he's a Scientologist or because he's weird.
No.
Like everything you think about why these things happen is wrong. Like it's money.
Yeah, it was a box office thing. It was nothing to do with...
It was Mission Impossible 2.
Yeah.
The deal he managed to get for that as a producer meant that he made more money than the studio.
Yeah.
So when that film made money, which it did, he made more money in the studio, and Paramount said, we cannot have this situation where one person is earning more than the studio. So that's why they got rid of Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
Like, he could have done most things, and arguably some stars have, but if they're making the money for the studio and they know their place in the hierarchy, It's maintained. It's a really interesting book. It talks about. There's a great story about Arnie's deal for Terminator 3. Which was like $30 million, regardless of whether the film gets made or not. That was the contract that they signed. They signed this. They pay $30 million for Arnie, and then they have to make the film. The film's terrible.
Yeah,
but they don't have no choice but to make it. Otherwise, like they just. But
that's a legacy from Total Recall, isn't it? Yeah. Because remember, that was the first one, I think, where he basically had veto over everything. Yeah. You know, it was like that moment where the director just doesn't matter anymore. You know.
Yeah. But we love Total Recall. Do we love Total Recall?
The original?
Yeah.
Oh, I love Total Recall. Yeah.
Well, it's great. I actually had that on my body horror list as well. Because it's very funny. Yeah, and it's so grotesque in terms
it's horrific at times.
But it also feels like, this, you know, the kind of the fears of like radiation and nuclear kind of it's that it touches a real nerve, that film.
I mean, even I think Tom Cruise is coming to the shelf life of him being able to open a movie. Who else is there that opens a movie on their name? I just Brad Pitt.
Well, but does he though?
Leo
is probably the last one that does that. And I think that, you know, you look at the money that people, even like Gosling, the movies that are not, even the ones that are kind of franchisey or at least kind of known property ones, he's not. I think that no one's making that kind of money. Leo is probably the last after Cruise. Because, again, Brad Pitt doesn't really make the movies. Look at Ad Astra. Big, Oscar-y performance. No money.
And is there any women? I don't think there is. I mean, you know, it's like Meryl Streep still would in a kudos kind of way, but you're not going to, you know, she's not going to make an action blockbuster, is she? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it'd be interesting. What was the... Well, maybe Charlize Theron.
Yeah. Scarlett Johansson, maybe.
Scarlett Johansson, but again, you know, she wanted more. You know, she wanted a different deal. So, what her future looks like is be interesting to see what happens with that, with the Disney thing. But then Charlize Theron was in the old guard, but that was a Netflix movie. You know, so our ideas of opening and where stars are, again, is completely skewed.
Back to the original point was, what has streaming done to marketing
it's changed
movies?
All of that.
All of that. Like studio. I mean, again, it's about properties, isn't it? And brands. It's like, here's this brand with a list of people in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is easier to do if it's the Batman. Than it is, because that's the property. That's what people are going to see. They're going to see that person as that thing, aren't they? Which is harder, you know. Which is, again, interesting to see what the Northman does. It's not even got that level of people. You know, it's got all their faces on the poster, and I'm excited because I like Ethan Hawke, but Ethan Hawke doesn't open a movie.
No.
Bjork doesn't open a movie.
No.
So where is the you know, and what are people going to see? And I think that, you know, that certainly seeing it in a big town, in a big multiplex at a big retail park, it was like, you know, wow, this place is, you know, there's a good 100 people here, which is, you know, but I think the thing is, like, that will quickly dissipate if those 100 people tweet or go on Facebook or whatever it is, or Instagram, and like, this movie's a pile of shit. Because I think it is going to be more of a risk for people in a way that it wasn't in the past. You know, it's like, because it doesn't look or feel like something that they know. You know, so whether it's the audience who have, you know, that's the old thing, isn't it? Like you sort of said about Del Toro, have the audience cause this, or are the audience responding to something which has been assumed that they want? Yeah. You know, and who has caused that? You know, is it a studio thing? Is it a streaming thing? You know, it is an interesting question.
Well, I mean, it's like the Pattinson thing with Batman. I don't think people are going to see Pattinson. They're going to see Pattinson as Batman, aren't they? It's like the branding of the of the quote unquote star, because he's not a movie opener. Back even Twilight, he made a conscious decision then to become more of an actor, you know, character actor.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, that was the thing when he was in Twilight and then made those decisions, and then when Daniel Radcliffe made the decisions that he made post Harry Potter, there was this idea that all of those people would turn up at Cosmopolis, or, you know, the one where he plays a corpse, Swiss Army Man, you know, which just didn't happen. You know, because you can engage with all of that stuff without seeing it now. Those fans can still be fans of Daniel Radcliffe and Robert Pattinson and talk about all of those films through memes on the internet. They never have to see it, but they can still be part of the fan machine and still say, we love Robert Pattinson. It's like, well, you didn't see these films. You didn't see The Lost City of Z. No. You know, so yeah, like that fan traffic it moves in a different way now. And it doesn't move backwards, as we know. Remember when we did the Memento episode, and we were surprised that people who love Nolan they have their entry point.
Yeah.
And then they might stay with that filmmaker.
Sure.
But that, well, how far do they go back? Will they go back? And it is a very different relationship that audiences have with this stuff now. But I'm just glad that it's still there. And, I was pleased that all the old knives popped up, because it was like, oh, actually, yeah, this will be a fun watch. But yeah, it's really hard to see how that's a sustainable model, because it's obviously even at that level, it's an expensive movie. A lot of people involved. So yeah.
Well, the last thing I just wanted to mention was that I rewatched Joker, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you did,
I really enjoyed it. And the reason I enjoyed it as well is because the proximity of watching to Nightmare Alley.
Yeah.
And I got the sense of the beauty and just the sort of the attention to detail in the imagery, and much more interesting imagery in Joker than in Nightmare Alley. I mean, the beauty of like I said, the controlledness of the lighting and the depth of field in Nightmare Alley is amazing. But then there were just elements of the syncing up of Joaquin Phoenix's performance to what the character was going through, and then in him inhabiting the space and the way he was being photographed, I thought was just really well done. There's a great scene when he basically, for the first time, beats up people who have been beating him up on the train. At the beginning, he gets the shit kicked out of him. And then there's this moment where he's halfway through the movie where he kind of becomes the Joker. And he goes to this bathroom, and Joaquin Phoenix just sort of does this almost like a Tai Chi thing in front of the mirror. And it just lingers on him. And it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
It's really sort of just gives you that kind of... here is somebody metamorphosizing into this character that that we all kind of recognize. I still think it doesn't kind of know where it's going, because there was no sort of sense of what was coming next. I think after the film, was there going to be a Batman that synced up to this, which clearly wasn't going to happen, and it leads into that. Again, the straight white guys are the incels are the evil ones in a really easy way. But yeah, it's just and again, what's funny is sometimes I think that when you've got a high def TV and you're watching it in 4K and you're quite close up to it, that gives you a really intimate experience in a way that can kind of be, I don't want to say better than going to the big screen, but you see the detail in a really, really nice way. So I really, I enjoyed it an awful lot more than I did, I think, first time round. And I think possibly because, as you were saying there, with Nightmare Alley, beyond the discourse, I wasn't listening to all the fanboys saying this is the greatest thing that's ever been made. Yeah, and I could take it for what it was.
Yeah, and it's hard to avoid that stuff, even when you're kind of trying, because it is almost like when you open the screen, it just the shouting. It's really hard to find.
This movie, you know what I mean?
This is the best movie ever made. There's a great. There's a great. I think it's a David Bordwell book about early film critics.
Yeah.
It's like the pioneers of film criticism. I can't remember the name of it, but it's such a great book about, and what I loved about that book, and I've certainly carried it with me, is this idea that, that those critics would know what it takes to make a film, in a sense of like, it's the fact that anything gets made that's coherent, just in the sheer mechanics of making a film, is remarkable. So they went in looking for moments. They weren't looking for this whole big unified thing, because like that's a very hard thing to do. So when it happens, great, but it's like, where is the filmmaking in here that's really great?
Yeah.
And they would see it once, obviously, so it's like they're looking for where the film is doing the thing that the film should be doing, not the cinematic thing. And obviously, if it's doing other things, great. But they were just much more forgiving of this idea that that all of it should be great and all of it should work, and all of it should be. And that's the thing, is it's like I've seen that more since reading that book and felt that more. Yeah. And certainly doing, writing the book about music docs, like a lot of the things I'm talking about is like, I can have this conversation about the Taylor Swift film, and I'm like, the film's okay. There's this bit in it, and you do have to watch the whole thing to see the bit, but this bit is where it's doing something really great and really interesting, and it's important, and it's this bit's important. The film is probably not, but so I love the idea of going back in and saying, well, actually, these things are great.
Yeah.
You know, and who cares that the script doesn't work or the messaging's off? Like, you know, what are we here for? Well, we're here for these moments, you know. And when there's the reason we've got our favorite films are because for us, it's all those moments.
Sure.
But if we're going in, and that's the thing is, it's like we've got to go in and everything has to be great and everything has to be understood and clear and, you know, politically aligned with our beliefs. It's like, that's not what I'm interested in, you know. And also, like, I know how hard it is to make a movie anyway. So trying to be a bit more, which I guess I think is why Nightmare Alley annoyed me. Yeah. Because I was like, this was easier to make than those other things. Probably, you know, even easier than Joker, I guess, in terms of the weight of context going in there is so big. Like, how do you get anything interesting out of this stuff? Yeah. When all of those voices and all those eyes are, you know, waiting for what it is, and it should be celebrated. Actually, like, there's this scene with the greatest actor of our time, doing something which is perfect for the medium. Yeah. So I shall rewatch at some point with a do that. I did it while ironing, so that's my domesticated labour was Joker at the 2.5 hours. It killed that. You know, how it was intended to be seen, I think.
I think that's definitely true. You know, it's phenomenological watching, you know, at its best.
Now all of our audience will have that image of you whenever you're talking about stuff. Was he ironing?
Was he
at this
ironing
point?
while that was going on? You know, well, there you go.
That's the new measure, isn't it? It's not thumbs up or thumbs down. This is a good ironing movie.
Absolutely. That's the next one episode. Good ironing movies.
Good ironing movies.
Well, it's great to have you here. Thanks very much for that chat. Hope everybody's enjoyed our kind of like pop-up episode of this.
Absolutely. It's nice to be back in the room with you. It's nice to be doing this still, and just chatting. What do they say? Shooting the breeze about movies. It's been really fun, and I hope people have enjoyed it.
Great. So this has been The Cinematologist. Thanks for listening.